People who have interviewed potential new hires. What are some of the weirdest or worst things you've encountered during the interview? 1. Handed in her resume in person. This is an important detail for later. She seemed normal enough. Looking for a part-time job, she was new to the area and was checking out opportunities. This is a grocery store she was applying to. 2. Called me the day before panicking, asking for directions to our location. It didn't seem like she knew she was talking to us, as she was asking directions to the store. Now she was here yesterday dropping off her resume. 3. Called to say she was going to be late because she forgot about an appointment. 3. Called to reschedule the interview for same time/day as the interview. She seemed to think it was a different day. 4. Called asking which bus to take to the interview. 5. Called to reschedule again. 6. Showed up 4 hours early wearing 2 different escorts. Each time she called, she sounded more and more drunk. It was sad. She clearly needed help. Story 2. Crying. She explained that she just cries sometimes for no real reason, and I accepted her explanation. She was a good hire. I would swing by her office, and sometimes she would be in there crying and working away. She was a graphic designer. This was at a design firm and was referred by someone I trust. 12 years on, she has 3 kids and sounds good. Story 3. I used to be the hiring manager for a store in a mall. Our back room was pretty tiny, so we did interviews in the food court. Usually it was pretty empty when it wasn't around lunch/dinner time, so it wasn't hard to find a table that was far enough away from everyone else. I was midway through interviewing someone when I saw a girl I didn't recognize walking towards us. She came over, sat down with us, put a little white pill on the table and said, "Take this pill," to the guy interviewing. Then she asked if I wanted one without actually saying what it was. When I said no, she started asking how I knew her friend. I told her I worked at a store and was interviewing him for a job, and she just said, "Oh, cool," and just continued to sit there. It took a few minutes for the guy to get it through to her that we weren't friends who met during an interview, but that this was the interview that she had crashed. Once she finally got it, she picked up the pill, got up, and wandered away. Story 4. Guy who said on his resume that he took inspiration from sea captains as his management style. We interviewed him, and he was very good at giving long, rambling soliloquies that didn't answer our question. He didn't get the job, but I wonder what he's doing these days. Story 5. Interviewing for student workers at a college bookstore. So we got a pretty wild variety of characters, but none like Lorenzo. This dude comes walking into the interview in some tattered cargo shorts, a dirty white tee, some flappy broken sandals, long mangy hair, and a scraggly beard. But the best part was the gourd. This mug, no joke, had a good-sized gourd hanging from a hemp necklace around his neck that he was using for a water bottle. Now, the assistant director and I both have a pretty solid sense of humor, and we know this interview is going to be special. We began asking him all the usual questions. Why do you want to work here? What were your favorite past jobs? All of which he answered really well, far beyond our expectations. At the end, we always had a fun questing in there as well. We asked Lorenzo if he could go anywhere right now. Where would he go? Amazon! I would go to the Amazon! And got up and started dancing around the office. I'd go do a rain dance in the rainforest. Man, I want to go so bad. And then he pounded the gourd. Best interview ever. Sadly, our executive director flat out no'd Lorenzo. The AD and I were tragically disappointed. We really wanted to give him the job just to see what happened. He became a bit of a campus legend, and we really did regret not being part of his journey. Rumor has it that after graduation, he boarded a plane to South America and was never heard from again. Dance on, buddy. Dance on. Story 6. The one that stands out the most to me was hiring for a new computer tech. Was a nice guy, seemed to know the basics, but was clearly new to the field. When I asked if he had any questions for me, his first one was, what is the process for transferring to a new position? I'm only applying here because there aren't any openings in accounting. Yeah, dude. Tell me right away you don't really want that job and don't intend to stay at it. I just looked at him blankly for about 15 or 20 seconds, and I think it dawned on him what he just did. The interview basically ended there, and I thanked him for his time and said I wouldn't be calling. I hope he learned from that. Story 7. I have so many. One of my favorites was an early morning interview at a large job fair the company I had just been hired to was hosting at our local convention center. This candidate has been there the night before and completed her application and some assessments and was asked to come back in the morning to interview. She was drunk, y'all. Not hungover, hiccuping, slurring, stinking drunk. She tried to hug me rather than shaking my hand. It was another woman and I doing the interview. She asked the candidate why she had left her last job, and she said, in the absolute thickest of accents, "Well, it's like this, you see. Me and my old man, we was getting a divorce, hiccup. So then I started sleeping with a whole bunch of guys at the office. Then me and my old man, we got back together and now I'm not allowed to work there no more." Story 8. I once was a warehouse recruiter, so you don't necessarily get the best candidates to begin with. One guy I asked, "Do you have anything on your background because we will be doing a background check?" He said no. At the end of the interview I asked again, I said, Tell me now, because we will be doing a background check. Says nope. Background check comes back, and guess what? Sure enough, it's not clean. Guy has an abuse on him. Like, man, come on, really? You have a very small chance of getting hired anywhere, and a 0% chance when you try and lie about it. Story 9. I was 25 years old, interviewing a woman twice my age who brought her dog. I asked her to tell me about a time she dealt with a difficult customer and how she resolved it. She proceeded to tell me about when she worked as a receptionist of the spa at a casino and how a drunk woman who was getting a massage started pleasure and refused to stop, so she had to physically intervene. She went into a lot of detail, and I was so uncomfortable trying to maintain professionalism. Story 10. I was interviewing someone who casually mentioned that one of their dogs had died after being left in the car during her workday. She then went on to ask if we have a place where she could keep her dogs at work. We do not, to which she replied that that's okay. They could stay in the car. We were hiring for a dog trainer position. Story 11. Not majorly weird, but always stood out to me. I was on the interview panel with the owner and project manager as I was in charge of training new hires. Guy comes in wearing skinny jeans and skater trainers. Already, I know the owner's annoyed because he's a stickler for dress code, shirt, trousers, escorts, in the office. His CV says he's already experienced in what we do, so we ask him some basic questions about the work he's done, and he gives some vague answers that don't really explain anything or indicate any real experience. Partway through the interview, the owner says that I'd be training him should he be successful, and he very obviously sneered and rolled his eyes. At the end of the interview, when asked if he had any questions, he said he likes going to gym, so he'd like 2 lunch breaks because of the amount of food he needs to eat, and also to actually get to the gym. Owner says we can discuss that if he's successful. Project manager and I didn't want him, but owner said we should invite him back for the second stage competency test and asked if I could contact him because he noticed the eye rolling. Owner also makes a comment about him being scruffy and tells me to make sure he comes dressed for work. I invite him back and tell him exactly the sort of thing he's expected to wear. He turns up a week later wearing the exact same stuff from his interview. It's clear during the quite simple competency test that he's barely done this type of work before, if at all. Ask him at the end if he's got any questions, and he asks what other responsibilities I had because I obviously wouldn't need to spend much time training him. Sidestep that, and he repeats the question about 2 lunch breaks. Owner phoned him the next day to tell him he wasn't successful, and he offered his services on a freelance basis for both work and training, even sending a follow-up email offering the same thing a few days later. Forgot to mention that he also turned up with 2 large tubs of pasta for the competency test and stopped partway to eat one of them, despite only being there for 2 hours, which was supposed to be an upper limit. Story 12. I was interviewing a graduating senior for an entry-level designer position, a position that would have required her to work closely with a writing partner and less directly with an entire team. I asked her how she approached working in teams, and she said, "Oh, I hate working in teams. Every time I do, everyone ends up ganging up on me, so I want to work alone here." Might as well have just ended the interview then and there, because that's not and never will be how advertising works. I pointed out her portfolio and asked her how she'd created those pieces. Hadn't she worked with the writer on the headlines or the body copy? She said no, her professor let her do everything herself because she'd told him she refused to work with anyone. I can't remember what school she went to, but they did her a massive disservice by letting her think that was normal. Story 13. Interviewed this lady who seemed okay, but we didn't hire her. Then she keeps emailing me asking questions about the job after she knew we hired someone else. Then she emailed me asking to meet up and hang out. Story 14. I wasn't on this panel, but an older man being interviewed responded to 2 of his questions with, "That's a stupid question," and "You tell me you work here." Needless to say, he didn't get the job. Another man bought lunch at the time of his interview and then complained he was being disturbed when someone went to call him through. Entitled weirdos. Story 15. I once had a new hire who harassed me. In the beginning, she seemed very well, and me and my team really thought about giving her the job. But when we invited her to make her an offer, it happened. We went to the meeting room. I work in a small company with a small office, so the meeting room wasn't that big. But then after she did some strange things like picking something up and put her ass in my face and putting her top down more and more, she crawled under my table and wanted to give me a you-know-what. I instantly stood up and sent her away. In the end, we found someone else for the job. I mean, she was hot, but in my opinion, things like this shouldn't happen at work. Story 16. I worked in HR for a long time. I was usually the first person new hires went through for admin jobs. I interviewed one guy who was creepy beyond words, winking at me, biting his lip. At the end, he said, "Well, I'm pretty sure I blew this interview, but would you hire me for a date?" I told him he has 30 seconds to leave before security was called. Story 17. I had a 24-year-old college graduate come into the interview with her father. I had multiple interviewees, so when I called her name and they both stood up, I told them it wasn't a group interview, and he'd be in when his name was called. He looked at me and said, "I'm her father. I'll be sitting in on her interview." I looked at both of them and said that wasn't happening, and he was not welcome to join us in the interview room unless he was an applicant on my list. He literally took her by the hand and walked her out. That was 8 years ago or so, and I still think about that poor woman. I was 25 at the time and couldn't imagine that being my life. Close second was the woman who came in and apologized for being late because her methadone clinic appointment took longer than usual. Story 18. Weird in other countries, but not in Ireland. It's not uncommon for the local parish priest to give a reference for people going for their first job. I had never encountered it myself when I first took a job at a recruitment agency, but I quickly learned that it's quite common. Story 19. Interviewed a young guy for an IT support job. He wouldn't have got the job because he had no idea about appropriate presentation and he kept swearing in the interview. But the weirdest thing was, he kept asking for details about our network security and firewalls and network switches, etc. I'm not sure if there was supposed to be some subtle threat that if I don't get the job, I'm gonna hack you, but it made everyone even more dubious about the guy's intention. Story 20. I was an admin at this construction company when a guy came in for an interview. He brought his cats with him. We had to put them, they were crated, in an empty office near my desk. They were so loud, I had people coming to my desk to figure out what was going on. Weird day. Story 21. Guy I worked with disappeared for a few days and then it transpired he got arrested and had to do time like a month or so. There were lots of rumors, but in the end, HR decided he had not done anything that hurt the company, so he was allowed to keep his job. Truth be told, he was extremely good at it. We never found out what he was arrested for, though. Somewhat later, I became this guy's manager. He then developed a feud with a coworker over a trivial issue. Well, trivial for the whole office, but not him. This festered for 2 years. He became unmanageable, was given a new direct manager a few times, but nothing worked. He became obsessed with the injustice he was exposed to and shouted in the corridors that this company was ducking him in the A. In the end, he admitted that he could not get over the fact that I, his manager at the time, allowed the facts he was upset about to happen. He also kept a massive diary with text and sketches and insisted I read it to understand what was eating him. Due to labor laws, it was not easy to get him fired, but we managed to do so in the end. But I left out one little detail. When I became this guy's manager, HR told me why he got arrested. It turned out to be buying and trading dirty material with minors in it. Okay, so this not came out of an interview. But guess who applied for a job with me a few months ago? The audacity. Story 22. Not an interview, but yesterday I received a resume that said, "I really think it's time for business and companies to change the way they hire everyone. I've been out of work over 4 years already and it's getting ridiculous. I may have not grown up in redacted, but I am more than qualified for all the jobs I applied for." Story 23. I once had an opposing attorney who went MIA for a few weeks. Just disappeared, missing persons reports, news articles, firm doesn't know where she is, the whole 9 yards. Then she was found at some hippie retreat a few hours away. Apparently she decided she needed some time away while she was driving to a hearing and just kept driving for a few days until she found her way there. Apparently she didn't take the most direct route. Totally abandoned her client without a word. Well, a few years later I was at a different firm and was asked to interview a candidate. Looked at the resume, thought, that name sounds familiar, but didn't have time to place it. As soon as she walked in, we both recognized each other and I could tell she knew she wasn't getting this job before the interview even started. Story 24. Young guy interviewed for a really well-paid IT admin position. Got all the qualifications we were looking for and made a really good impression to all of us. More or less got the job. Interview was close to its end. Just to let you know, I'm not planning to work in IT for the rest of my life. I want to start a career as a rapper. I'm getting quite popular on YouTube already. Oh wow, can you show us? 3 songs released. Less than 1,000 views, but whatever. Yet every second sentence was how he will catch and kill those Koreans. Just pure aggressive hate speech. Thanks for showing up. You will hear from us. Story 25. I was interviewing a woman for a management position at a tech firm in the South. There was really no mention of a job on her resume, so I asked her about her experience managing people. In her sweetest Southern Belle drawl, she told me that she managed the groundskeeper, the cleaning personnel, and the household staff. After I got my wits about me, I asked if she had technical experience with computers. When she admitted no, I told her that I was sorry, but that was a major requirement of the job. Story 26. I have interviewed lots of people, but don't recall anything weirdly noteworthy. Most of the weirdness showed up after they were hired. My wife once had someone show up to an interview for a corporate job escorted by his mother, who tried to come into her office and sit in on it. The guy was in his early 20s and was not disabled or anything, as far as she knew. He didn't seem too keen on getting the position, and in fact did not get it. His mother called my wife for the next few weeks, wanting to know why he wasn't hired, asking for another interview, asking about open positions in any other departments. It was insane. My wife had a few choice words with the HR rep who put this guy through, as well as her boss, having stronger, choicer words with the head of security for his guards, letting this woman in the building. Story 27. Nothing too crazy. You can tell when people get nervous by long-winded and unending sentences to sell themselves, or they go blank when having to answer a question. I found that you got a better feel for the candidate by having decent interviewing skills. Put them at ease, seem personable, allow them to relax. I think if you get them in a place where they are comfortable, you get a better response or read off of what they bring to the table. People that are S to interviewees or do stump the chump bullcrap are probably people you don't want on a work for. Story 28. The weirdest was someone falling asleep at the beginning of an interview. We were interviewing about 45 people for 10 positions, so we documented all the answers and scored them to make selections easier at the end of the week. This guy walks in, we do introductions, and give him a minute to read over the questions we will be asking while we start our paperwork. By the time the minute is up, this dude is out cold. No idea how you can walk in a room, sit in front of 5 people, and be relaxed enough to fall asleep. Story 29. A young girl took a big pause after I asked a question, then replied, "Could we reschedule this? It was my friend's birthday last night. I'm too hungover to process what you're asking right now." Story 30. We did panel interviews, so like 4 to 6 supervisors interviewing you together. A guy shows up looking profesh and upbeat. Just before the interview starts, he runs to the restroom, vomiting but still wants to interview. 10 minutes later, still vomiting. We offer to reschedule, but he really wants the job and wants to do the interview. Another 15 minutes, still vomiting, and we called it off. Couldn't hold up the entire middle management of a pretty big company any longer. He came in a few days later and got the job. Story 31. These are different people, but some of my favorite moments from my interviewing days. What's one mistake you've made and how did you address it? Well, one time I was a camp counselor and me and my friend were trying to start a fire, but we couldn't find the lighter fluid, so we sprayed bug spray all over the fire pit and then lit it, and, well, that was a mistake. What sort of team environment do you prefer? I hate teams. I'm fine alone. Most people don't like me, but that's fine. People are too sensitive these days, too. That's why I won't work with anyone under 35. You get it. I bet you hate working with all these 20-somethings. I was 25. Why do you want this job? My husband's being a real Karen and says I need to work. It's not like we need the money. He's just an asshole. Please upload your cover letter. Okay, here's 6 pages about how your web design is crap. He did not get an interview, but honorable mention. What is your greatest professional accomplishment? I was in an episode of Seinfeld, and an honorable mention to the time I was conducting a phone interview and had the hiccups. Nothing was working to get rid of them, and I have these horrible, super loud hiccups that sound like I'm screaming. The interviewee managed valiantly not to laugh at me once. Straight into the higher pile he goes. Story 32, one other one. When interviewing people for a software development position, we would start with entry-level technical questions to warm them up and increase the complexity up to and beyond the level of the position. 2 reasons. 1, to ensure they have the appropriate skills and experience. 2, by stressing them beyond what they would reasonably be expected to know, we find out how they handle stress, if they'll try to BS us and such. One guy turned the tables on it. Knew his stuff, didn't BS us on the limits of his knowledge, and was absolutely unrattled by our feeble, as it turns out, attempts to stress him. We decided to hire him right there. Got to the friendly shooting the breeze stage of the interview having already decided he was a yes, and asked him what he used to do. Resume just listed U.S. military experience. Turns out he used to be a driver of an armed escort/patrol vehicle in Iraq during the war. No wonder we couldn't rattle him. A couple of geeks in a conference room was nothing. He turned out to be a great hire. Story 33. I was a programmer interviewing other programmers. Our process involved taking a test on site and then doing an in-person interview. I got a guy's resume, looked really solid, like 10 years at Samsung doing big things, senior engineer, high-level stuff, although none of it was super relevant to us since we were a game studio. Whatever, we'll chat with him. As I went to do the in-person interview, my manager pulled me aside and said somehow the test machine failed or something, so we didn't get a test result for him. So make sure you really get down in the weeds on his interview. Okay, that's very weird. It's worked for every other candidate, but hey, whatever. I get in there and there's this guy with stringy gray hair wearing ratty clothing. I introduce myself, and the minute he goes to answer me, I notice he's missing his top 4 front teeth. This is a guy who, based on his resume, has been making 6 figures for years, while simultaneously having full medical benefits. But I scold myself. You don't know what's going on here. There might be a medical reason he can't wear a bridge. You should be ashamed of yourself making assumptions. Then I started the interview, and it was clear within 2 minutes that this guy's resume was made up or more likely stolen. He knew basically nothing about programming at all. It was like he had maybe skimmed through a textbook. It got really awkward really quickly, and we ended the hour-long interview within 20 minutes. The crazy part was this guy was interviewing for a senior position. Like, if you're going to try to just BS your way into a job, maybe start with something a little lower down. Story 34. I will never forget the resume of a woman who felt compelled to provide a headshot. Looked like your average aging grandma redneck, complete with graying mullet, and the email address on her resume was sexybutterfly69. This was for a position in equipment finance. She did not make it to the personal interview round. Story 35. We had some dumb interview questions we always had to ask, as they were set by corporate, but they got some interesting answers. One question was aimed at assessing how well employees present themselves. We worked with high-income clients, and entry-level employees had contact with them from time to time. The question was, if you spilled coffee on yourself on the way to work, what would you do? The answer they wanted was something about changing. Two best responses. My entire wardrobe is black, so it wouldn't matter. Pull over and assess for burns. Story 36. Two guys interviewed with me for a fairly basic, low-paying job. They turned up in tuxedos. Initially, I thought that was ironic and I liked their vibe. But then, one of them let off the loudest, longest fart I've ever heard. I could taste it. Then, the tuxedo seemed kind of ducked up. Story 37. Interviewing for a childcare position, she left her 2-month-old alone in the car for the entire almost 1.5-hour interview. One of the other employees noticed when she came back from lunch. It's literally a childcare facility if she needed someone to watch her child. While she interviewed, it wouldn't have been even a little bit of a problem. Story 38. I had a dude show up for an in-person interview wearing a fez and sweatpants. Either of them would have been an odd choice separately. Together, though, pick a lane, man. Story 39. Had a video interview with a dude for a product management spot. Dude looked like he just got out of bed, spent the first 5 minutes telling us how amazing he was, then 10 minutes telling us how everything we did was wrong. Our presentation deck we had sent him had typos, and if he joined the company, he would fix all of this and put us out of jobs. We didn't send him a presentation deck. He was applying for an outsourced position. The company he worked for had created an dummy, in general this is what to expect, PPT, and sent the deck. We advised him of this and that. We aren't the team that would even touch what he was talking about. He went, oh, then clearly this isn't a job I want, and ended the interview. We put him on the never hire list. Story 40. I was observing a science lesson being taught as part of the interview process. The guy started making jokes about how the chemicals looked like Class A substances to a class full of 11 to 12-year-olds. Strangely, we did not hire him. Story 41. I had a resume come through that I rejected out of hand, but thanks to HR, I still had to interview. During early checks, I found the guy's identity had been stolen. Like bad. Everything. I tried to keep it together during the interview, but about 5 minutes in, I told the guy straight out, "You're not getting the job and you have a serious problem to sort out." We spent about 15 minutes going over the depth of the identity theft. I'm honestly not sure if I was talking to the thief or the victim. Anyways, thanks for that super awkward interview. HR. Story 42. Interviewing a software developer candidate. Initial phone screen. His phone was too good, too sensitive of a microphone. During some technical programming questions, I could hear him flipping pages in a book. I could tell from the cadence of his answers he was reading them. This was confirmed when, at one point, he lost his place and reread the same line. There was no second interview. Story 43. At the time, Windows Server 2016 was becoming the standard server operating system. We had a guy who was looking for nearly a 6-figure salary and only had knowledge of Win98. It was really sad. His previous employer never updated anything, and this poor guy was tricked into thinking that was the norm. While yes, there are some circumstances that happens, it is not standard. Story 44. Had a guy tell me I was doing his head in by asking him standard interview question. He subsequently swore at the members of the interview panel and hung up on the Zoom interview a few minutes later. I had an interesting chat with the HR person who did the pre-vetting. Story 45. I'm a programmer. I usually ask a pretty basic question like, what things do you consider when writing or improving an algorithm? It's a pretty basic question, really. Most people usually say something about memory usage or the type of inputs and outputs, etc. One person, who was already a little nervous and clearly underqualified, went into a nervous rant about how algorithms are useless and how people use algorithms as a way to show intellectual superiority and stuff. Then she tried to grill me like, when have you actually used algorithm? So I gave her a couple examples and she started to realize that algorithm is a pretty broad term and doesn't just refer to bubble sort and stuff. It was a pretty painful interview, and at one point I started asking her about her dog or her summer plans, just to lighten the mood. Story 46. In a restaurant, applying for a dish position. He got up after the interview was over and walked to another table, grabbed the Texas Pete hot sauce bottle, chugged it, not easy to do, did a couple laps around the dining room while head banging, and then left. I wanted to hire the guy, but I never actually got his name because he didn't fill out an application. I was shorthanded at the time, and he showed up at an opportune moment. I had the application on my clipboard for him to complete. Still think about that guy to this day. Story 47. A woman started hiccuping about 3 minutes in, and by 10 minutes, we reset the interview for the next morning. Hired her. Welcome gifts included a paper bag, a glass of water, and a long-handled teaspoon. She thought it was funny. When she was promoted to department manager, she announced that anyone who could hiccup for more than 5 hours would get a 2% pay raise and told everyone that she had to go to the ER the evening after round 1 because it wouldn't stop. Story 48. I interviewed a guy, 30 years old, wife and kids, for a job once. I asked, "What are your hobbies?" He told me he had one but stopped it immediately. I asked what that was. He had built a pipe bomb and it blew up in his hands. His chest took most of the blast and he was flown by chopper to hospital where he was rushed to the ER. Surgery. He died twice on the table while they stitched him back together. He offered to show me the scars and I declined. I asked why. He said he'd always wanted to make one. No plans, no blueprint, just build a pipe bomb. I said, "This was like when you were a teenager, right? Just doing dumb crap." "Oh no, I did this 3 years ago." He didn't get the job. Story 49. Not an interviewer, but a position my boyfriend applied for. He went in to interview for this manual labor position that had been recommended to him by someone else. The interview went all right despite the owner/manager being quite gruff. My boyfriend calls back a few days later to follow up, and the guy goes off on him. He became really aggressive and kept saying, "I don't know you. What do you want from me? I don't know you. I don't owe you anything." The guy was extremely upset. He never quite figured out what he was upset about. It was weird. Needless to say, he didn't get the job. Story 50. I once had an applicant sitting across from me doing the attic scratching thing. I hadn't even gotten to asking about past jobs when she started in on a long-winded rant about how she was trying to sue her past employer for wrongful termination. They had accused her of stealing. It was the height of COVID, and everyone needed workers. Nobody would falsely accuse someone of stealing when you need someone to do a cashier job. On that same day, the next applicant that walked in had literally stolen my assistant manager's TV. Story 51. Not to be a party pooper, but a lot of the wacky interview stories out there are people who don't really want the job but have to prove they're doing interviews so they can continue to claim benefits or whatever. People who do wild, inappropriate things at the interview weren't really even trying to get the job. Story 52. A person I know went to interview for a state job. He did well with the hiring administrator. The administrator is a woman who was wearing open-toe high heels and had her toenails painted and had some glitzy jewelry on them. She took him to show him around, and for some reason he asked, "How did they put that on your toes?" Then he reached down and with his finger tried to peel off the jewelry. He didn't get the job. Story 53. Not weird, but it took a really sad turn. Coworker was in a serious surfing accident. They destroyed her vocal cords. She can talk, but it sounds very scratchy. She was interviewing an applicant with me for an executive position over the phone. Interview went okay then. When we wrapped up the call, they forgot to hang up and very loudly and clearly mocked my coworker's voice and commented about how horrible she sounded. They did not get the job. Ducker. Story 54. This one old lady came in. She was wearing a really large t-shirt with no bra. Her boobs were sagging down to be about in line with her belly button. Her nipples were cross-eyed, pointing off to different corners of the office. When asked about her favorite job ever, it was working for Pizza Hut, like when they had the sit-down restaurants everywhere. "Oh, cool, I thought finally we can get somewhere in this interview," as her other responses to these types of questions has been short without detail, but she somehow lit up to this one. "So, did you like working with all the customers?" "No, I didn't help customers. I cleaned the bathrooms." Sigh. On to the next question. Before I can ask, she recalls one other tidbit. Sometimes when they got busy, they'd let me answer the phone. Ah yes, splendid detail. Story 55. A woman's husband showed up and asked about all the potential opportunities for him. He had gotten hired, and we were interviewing her as a courtesy, basically because academia. And he just steamrolled the whole thing, and it was utterly bizarre. And I was also so young at the time, I didn't understand I could just kick him out. But just so weird. Story 56. Myself and 2 others were interviewing candidates for a medical scribe program. They chart for doctors in real time, so the docs don't have to. Me. What do you like to do for fun? Candidate. I like to dissect things and see what's inside of them. So creepy. Story 57. My employer told me one of the other candidates for my job balked up her interview massively when the panel asked her what would you do if really common scenario in this profession type question. She said, "I have no idea." The panel just waited, assuming she needed a bit of thinking time to put an answer together, and after a few seconds of silence, she then said, "Are you deaf?" I said, "I don't know." Story 58. You'd ask a pretty straightforward question like, "We use program along with X program. Can you tell us about your experience with these?" Then the dude would go off on a borderline rant about something not related, but still tie it back with, And that's how we utilized that in my prior role. Asked how he dealt with difficult leaders, and he talked about how much smarter he was than everyone, and how it makes it easy to work with difficult people because they can be easily persuaded. The whole interview was like that. It was like he just heard what he wanted to. When we ended it, we stood up, shook his hand, and he said, "I look forward to starting here and being in your job in 18 months. We chose not to hire him and flagged his info as a solid do not interview. I do wonder where he ended up. Story 59. Mom came to the interview. I was a hiring director for software developers for a telecom. Brought this guy in for an interview. Came through security and asked for him. He stood up and an older woman stood up. Deduct data is all I could think of, see her stand. They both started trying to come through security with me. I told her that she was not invited to the interview. She told me that she had to come to the interview. That is when the interview ended. She asked for my boss's phone number. Oh, I gave it to her. I walked into my VP's office to a puzzled look on his face and him trying to not laugh. We would bring her up anytime we went out drinking. Story 60. Used to be a hiring manager for a large company, and one girl I interviewed literally got mad at me when I told her to put her phone away, then proceeded with an attitude for the rest of the interview. When I asked her if she even wanted to be here, she got mad, called me a slur, and left. She had the audacity to call a few days later and ask about the interview and if she was hired. When I told her no, she called me a slur again and hung up. To this day, I don't know if she was playing some elaborate prank or what, but her audacity was so astounding, I'll never forget the whole ordeal. Story 61. I work at a medical school and we were hiring for an administrative assistant to work with our OBGYN doctors. It should go without saying that most medical schools are still rather conservative fields to work in. This girl shows up for the interview and the interview she gets asked, "Since you'd be working with doctors, you'd be seeing a lot of graphic images of the human body. Are you okay with that?" Without missing a beat, girl responds, "Yeah, I look at nudes." She did not get the job. Story 62. I was part of a team interview for a technical position. We were his last interview. Halfway through, HR opened the door and said, "We're through, get out." Turns out the guy lied on his resume. Not only did he not have a PhD, he never finished college. HR did a background check and surprise. We had flown him across the country, flew him back the same day. He did talk a good game, dropping journal references and names. Complete BS. Story 63. I was on an interview panel. We were interviewing a lateral employee, a middle-aged white woman. We're a dispatch center in a diverse area, city and rural and suburb, about 300,000 population, all sorts of stuff near several military bases. She moved to the area from Montana or Utah or something and had previous job experience, so it was going fine. The interview had a series of questions, and they're like obvious questions only Sloth from the Goonies would duck up, you know? Not only that, they were yes and no questions. One of the questions was, "Do you have experience working with people from different ethnic and racial backgrounds?" Fairly simple. There is no wrong answer, but it helps to see if you're a good fit for the job because you're going to deal with lots of different types of people regularly. Her answer, "Oh yes, I've worked with black, but you know what kind of word was, lots of times before." I was so stunned, I couldn't say anything, I just laughed. Training supervisor ended the interview right then and there. We did not end up hiring her. Story 64. I was visiting a friend in London who worked in one of the famous coffee shops there. The next morning, he had an interview to run a new cafe that was opening in a few weeks. When I woke up, I had a message on my phone to meet him at the new cafe. I got there and he looked wrecked, dirty, eyes hanging out of his head, struggling to stay upright. Turns out his girlfriend had broken up with him the night before and locked him out of their flat. He slept in the gutter outside, or tried to, and after explaining this to the new cafe owner, I did his interview for him while he slept on the floor. I'd worked with him a few years before, so I answered with, well, he was great at this and his best attributes, blah, blah, blah. I even did a practical test showing them his methods. He got the job in the end and now has one of the most successful shops of his own in Berlin. Story 65. I did staffing for chemical plants and one guy gave me a gift. One girl couldn't tell me any classes she took, and a lot of blaming politics for why they don't get raises/promotions at their current jobs. The excuses for failed substances tests are more entertaining though. Story 66. I helped my old boss screen applicants when I worked for a trucking company. Numerous potential drivers asked me if we substances tested and then proceeded to tell me the last time they smoked something. Story 67. Asked what they wanted to do with their career at the company, and they described something that has absolutely nothing to do with our field of work at all. Took me a second to figure out how to politely respond. Story 68. Guy shows up in a $2,000 purple suit, no tie, red striped shirt, gold rings, huge gold necklace, purple pork pie hat, and Italian loafers. Looked like a 1970s pimp or men's club owner. Refused to answer most of the questions, saying, "Come on guys, that question is beneath me. Give me something harder." Simply oozed confidence and swagger. For a junior systems administrator position. Wanted $250,000 plus salary. We did not hire him. Story 69. Question was, why do you want to work here? Answer: X found me at my current job and informed the courts, and they started garnishing my wages. I need to find another job that my ex doesn't know about so I can quit. Didn't seem like he should even get points for honesty here. Story 70. I had a guy bring his mom into the interview. Like, not just to wait, actually tried to come into the boardroom with him. The interview did not go forward. Story 71. Guy told me how he screwed over some clients. Not wanting to waste time, I told him I wasn't going to hire him. He told me I was wrong. I told him that I was absolutely right, that I wasn't hiring him. He said it was because I was afraid that he'd take my job. I laughed and said no matter the reason, he wasn't hired. He stood up, broke the chair he was sitting in, and stormed out. Story 72. I was an engineering manager in a subsidiary of a large graphics company in the 90s. One candidate for a software dev position came in to interview and told us he had written a song about us. During one of the interviews, he proceeded to sing it for us. It was awkward and charming at the same time. For other reasons, he didn't get the job. Story 73. Not my story. My daughter was interviewing a young woman for a position at a very large bookstore chain. At one point in the interview, my daughter asked the young woman what was one thing she liked about herself. The young woman thought for a few seconds, then said she liked that her boobs were big. Story 74. Used to like to throw in random questions that would show you how the person thinks. So one time asked, if you were a vegetable, what would you be? And her answer, quick as a button, I would be a cucumber so I could duck. Story 75. The candidate told me that he believed God had led him to this opportunity. Unfortunately, he was really well qualified and had come highly recommended by a current great employee, so we hired him. Story 76. Was part of a committee interviewing for individuals for the supervisor of my department. I had 3 interesting interviews. 1. When asked, how would they handle a last-minute project with a short deadline that couldn't be reasonably achieved in the time frame under normal circumstances, they said they would do anything to get it done, including requiring the team to work long hours. All of us were overtime exempt and underpaid. A real case of not knowing your audience. 2. We had one person who had no experience in the field that was only being interviewed because she knew the director. She didn't even know what the team did and acted like the job was already hers. To be fair, that is how her predecessor got the job and had the same experience, but that person was both still with the organization and still banging the director. But that person only lasted 3 months in the position, hadn't gone through an interview process, and the board had intervened since the current interview was scheduled, placing the director on probation and suspending any personnel decisions he could make. 3. One person, who ended up being the runner-up, was used by the director as an example of bad work in the field in a speech. While he didn't mention her by name, he mentioned her current organization and the paper she wrote that had been given to him to review. She used it as an example of her work in the interview. The primary person turned down the offer and she was offered the position. By then, she had heard of it and turned down the offer too. I left before the 3rd and 4th choices also turned it down. Story 77. When I was the manager of a small, locally owned coffee house, we were interviewing for a new barista. A guy turned in his resume with no relevant coffee experience, but we decided to interview him anyway. He showed up in an ill-fitting brown suit, which was not our vibe, but fine. Way to make an effort. I greeted him, asked if he'd like something to drink from the coffee bar, and he said, "Oh, no, I never drink coffee," which, okay. I then introduced myself. I'm Leather Aardvark, the manager here at the coffee house, and then asked why he wanted to work with us as a barista. He then started in on a spiel about all of his management experience and how he will be an excellent manager and is well qualified for this job. This was not reflected in his resume. It was probably about 10 minutes of the qualities he liked in himself. I just sat there stunned. I let him know that we didn't currently have a manager position open and asked if he was interested in the open barista position. He was not, only interested in management. And here's the thing. If I thought he'd be a better manager than I was, I would have suggested hiring him. But he would not be a better manager. He would also not be a good barista. I'm not sure what job that guy would be good at, but I hope he found it. Story 78. In early 2021, I was chief operating officer of a large engineering firm in Texas and was interviewing candidates for a VP of sales and marketing position. I had been off work the week prior for a family emergency, and this particular candidate's original interview had been rescheduled to that day. The candidate began his interview complaining about having to wear a mask and proceeded to explain to me how icy a policy it was and how the virus was fake, and how he couldn't believe the government would force such ridiculous requirements on businesses. I calmly stood up and told him that the family emergency which had resulted in our rescheduled interview had been my traveling to stand outside the window of a hospital in a vain attempt to comfort my mother in her final moments of what was a truly terrible death from COVID. I then less graciously told him to get the duck out. Needless to say, he didn't get the job. Story 79. Not so much an interview as a trial that went extremely poorly. I needed a position filled at my company, and it turned out my friend's wife had the skill set we needed, so we took her on board and things immediately went awry. She couldn't follow simple instructions and had to have every task spoon-fed to her, to the point that I might as well do the work myself. And the work she did produce would almost always not be what I asked for. I relayed this to my friend, and her solution floored me. She deadass offered for me to hire her to interpret between her wife and the rest of the team. She expected me to hire her as a translator when English was all our first language. It was obscene. Nonetheless, I declined, and our friendship ended shortly after. Story 80. Context: I have partial heterochromia. Both of my eyes are primarily green. My right eye is about half yellow, and my left eye has a large yellow blob. I'm used to people commenting on it when they notice. So I'm interviewing this candidate, and he is making intense eye contact. Every question was met with a delayed response or a request to repeat it. At the end of the interview, I asked him if he had any question. Word is bond. He actually asked me if he could take a picture of my eyes. He was not qualified for the position. I try to keep my emotions out of the process, especially with a no. I was happy in this case because I'm almost certain he would hurt me for my eyeballs. Story 81. I had an interview scheduled. On the surface, their resume looks solid and didn't see any problem. The young person walks in and is clearly nervous. No problem. As I understand, it can be an unusual situation. However, I notice that he takes out his phone and says, "Can we call my parents?" I honestly thought he was making a joke. I tried several times to keep it casual and just have a conversation. On paper, he had all the qualifications, but definitely seemed to have some form of Asperger's or ADHD. I'm not a health professional. According to his LinkedIn profile, he seemed to be doing well last I checked, but always felt bad for how he seemed to be sheltered with so much potential. Story 82. I've been in countless roles where I have to hire people, but the one that stands out more than any other was when, while working as a lead trainer for a national telecom company, I interviewed a guy for a sales position that absolutely nailed the interview. I couldn't believe how good he was and how good his answers were, compared to the usual dredge we talked to. Then, at the very end, he told me he'd binged on bars and tar the night before and asked me if I'd ever blacked out on dope and nannies. It was like he didn't even realize that this topic was not acceptable in a professional context. Story 83. Had someone come in for an interview and 10 minutes in they went to the bathroom for a long time. Came back like nothing had happened, only to excuse themselves again. An educated guess is that it turned out they had progressively worse food poisoning, and the poor person was stuck in our bathroom for about 90 minutes. We also only had one bathroom, so we had to go across the street. Eventually, they were well enough to slip out. The bathroom was unusable for the rest of the day. They seemed like a good candidate too. Never heard from them again though. Story 84. I had a real-life Dwight Schrute, who not only dedicated a significant section of their resume to their karate and martial arts experience, but made it a point to connect every regular interview question to something martial arts related. The job has nothing to do with martial arts. In fact, it's a pretty standard corporate desk job. We identify fraud, but no one is kicking down doors. They did not get the job. Story 85. Interviewed this guy for a programming position in React. He continuously talked about how Flash was the only good thing. Everything else was a waste of time. It's criminal that they got rid of it. He hates programming and having to use anything instead of Flash, like nonstop for 15 minutes. Flash good, everything else bad. When we denied him, he called our HR lady a stupid Karen. Story 86. Not me, but my mom. She works from home and used to do interviews, and she would leave some literally laughing at how bad they were. Once she asked someone, "So your resume says call center experience. What kind of call center experience do you have?" And the candidate said, "I worked the headset at Wendy's." Story 87. We were hiring a computer security guy. One guy could not answer any of the questions, and when he realized he had failed the interview, spent 2 solid hours whining about how unfair life was. Story 88. Not long after, I was promoted into manager of the IT dept at a subsidiary of a public company, meaning we worked with the corporate IT group who handled infrastructure while we managed subsidiary-specific systems. I had 2. 1. The first was someone interviewed for a support technician role. I always throw out scenarios based on incidents I've experienced. One such was a DHCP issue where people were getting addresses from something other than our systems, the result of someone bringing a home router and plugging it into our network. The person interviewed was a bit stumped and made a few reasonable answers, which is what I kind of look for, seeing what steps they would take to figure it out. The response was to yell at me and say, "That is not allowed." Yes, you are correct, it is not allowed. However, users sometimes do things like that and not realize it becomes a disruption. It is our job to find and resolve the issue. And again, they yelled, "But that is not allowed," loud enough that people outside of the conference room I was using for this could hear. 2. I had a very confident candidate tell me he knew what he was doing and did not have to use Google to fix problems. If you have worked in IT, the ability to research issues is a must. The response was pretty arrogant. And I only say it is weird because as someone looking to hire you, being so arrogant that you state you don't have to do what is one of the most common aspects of that particular job just made me think, this is someone who got by on others basically doing their work. Story 89. People coming in pajamas, flip-flops, stained t-shirts, sweatpants, completely non-matching clothes, people covered in animal hair and smell, people with no personality at all, not smiling. I would ask questions to these people, like, what makes you smile? And they would, with a dead stare, no expression, answer, my kids. I would hire people for jobs that require a lot of energy, so during the interview we would walk around the building, upstairs, downstairs. The number of people who couldn't make it up the stairs without sounding like they were gonna die is uncountable. This is after asking them questions about being able to do the job, which they would always answer yes without any hesitation. Customer service interviews where I would ask questions like, what would you do if someone had X issue and came to you upset? And they would answer, well, first they going to have to calm down, or I'm gonna tell them about themselves because I don't deal with that ill snap. So many interviews, so many people who I'm sure tell others, I don't know, I guess no one's hiring, I can't find a job anywhere. Something interviewers said that indicates they're not going to hire you? Story 1. For me, it has been less about what they said and how they changed their approach to communicating with. One, I was sure I wouldn't get because of how the hiring manager talked to me as she walked me back to the entrance, different from her enthusiasm at the start. Funny enough, she reached out to me in a frantic manner months later, asking if I was still interested. Spoke on the phone, and she basically said I was the last choice, and now they were going to have to repost the job since I was declining. Just bad hiring practices all around. She blamed HR for being so slow, but it was obvious I was last on some list that they deemed minimally acceptable, and therefore there was zero communication for months. Story 2. Body language or the tone of the interviewer's attitude, where they don't care about the interview, is what I'm seeing more on here. Yeah, we found a very nice place right along the river close to downtown. She said, oh, that sounds expensive. And I said, yeah, thankfully my wife makes good money, but now I just need someone to hire me. Polite chuckle. And her response, oh, I'm sure someone will hire you. I have seen this too, where they ask a personal question off the record, and people tend to reveal too much to point where they won't get the job. It is why I tell interviewers not to engage in personal talk outside the interview. If the manager asks where you live or where you got a place, let them know location area, and that is it. Don't reveal how much your spouse makes, as it's a red flag to the employer, even if it's not during the interview. Story 3. This was earlier in my career. I went to an interview who I knew someone there, and it went well. I talked to people, and it went fine. I was walked to the door by the guy I knew, and I asked him this, is there any qualified internal candidates that are interviewing? At that moment, I saw his eyes drop, and he then composed himself, then said, yeah, and then said some other crap. But I could tell the decision was made, and I was just a token interview. Story 4. We have an internal candidate is code for company policy requires us to post all jobs and provide perfunctory lip service to 2 external candidates, but you don't have a snowball's chance in hell of getting this job, and we're just wasting your time to check our internal control box. Story 5. After a couple rounds, I was meeting with one of the higher-ups. At the end of the interview, he told me they had narrowed it down to 3 people, and I was the first of the 3 he talked to. One of the other 2 was a referral. I almost asked why he didn't schedule the referral first, figuring that guy would have to show up in a Hawaiian shirt and flip-flops and insult him and his wife to not get the job. Story 6. I only hire fully remote employees, so all interviews are done through video conference calls. My telltale sign that the candidate is not moving forward is if I stop asking any clarifying questions. In addition to the questions, the interview will not take the full allotted time. If I'm doing a group interview, I will have a code word that we use to terminate the interview. So if the interview kind of stops abruptly and moves to the phase where the candidate is able to ask questions, then that is another sign that the candidate is not moving forward. Story 7. If they infer or accuse the applicant of job hopping, it's a no from them. Sometimes an applicant can have 6 months average at a job before they get accused of job hopping. Or it can be 3 years, depending on whether the interviewer has someone in mind they want to hire and are looking for an excuse to say no to that candidate. Once that accusation is said out loud, it's over. Story 8. The interviewer didn't pay attention. My husband was one of 2 candidates on the last interview with the company president. The guy showed up on time, but didn't pay attention at all. He even had a discussion with someone who walked in mid-interview. No shock after they sent a rejection email to my husband. Personally, it's not really what they say. I've had plenty of interviews that went well and didn't end with an offer. I've had plenty that I was sure went wrong and did get an offer. In my current role, I was sure I lost the job because the company's CEO grilled me. No smile or emotion, just intensity. Turns out that's just who he is, and I had the job from the phone screen. Story 9. I asked about the specific values of the company at the end of the interview, and the interviewer said, "I was going to ask you about them, but I wasn't sure you researched them." I kind of laughed and almost ended the call there. Story 10. I can tell by body language and delivery, especially during the second interview phase. I've been the person who was clearly a top candidate and a schmuck they were going through the motions for. Night and day. Not even close. Story 11. From the little experience I have from the onset of any friction introduced in the interview, you're likely not to get the job. So the moment I notice any form of friction from the interviewer, be it from body language, tonation, how they phrase their questions, if there's any friction, it's likely over. Story 12. We do have a lot of applicants for this role, meaning we're going to see if there's anyone better, but you likely won't get the job. Don't call us, we'll call you. Story 13. I will never forget talking to an interviewer who was Scrum Master for the group, and I'd just been certified for the role. He asks where I'd like to go in the future. Scrum Master would be nice, I said, but I'm the Scrum Master the interviewer cried like a spoiled kid denied a fifth Twinkie. I'm like, you never go on vacation or get sick? What happens when you aren't here? Work doesn't stop, I'm sure. Weird look on the guy's face. Doesn't stop, right? The tone of that interview faded real fast. Story 14. My most recent interview in which I knew right off the bat that I wasn't getting the position. 1. Started with both people interviewing me complaining about how early it was and yawning. I didn't recommend the time, I only agreed to it. This definitely set the stage though that they didn't want to be there and talking to me. 2. The more senior interviewer said his kids were getting ready for school and his wife ready for her job, so he was going to be distracted but would still be involved in the call. He subsequently asked no questions and frequently turned off his camera as he moved throughout the house and carried on side conversations with family. This person still works for this company. 3. The junior interviewer made a wholehearted effort to engage me with questions and responded to my answers. She and I went back and forth a bit on several questions, discussing the technology that the company uses. I appreciated her effort in comparison to the senior interviewers, but I knew from the jump that that job wasn't mine. Story 15. In an interview last week towards the end, one of the people interviewing me said, "We are posting more jobs in the near future, so if you don't get this one, keep applying." And then 2 days later, got the rejection email. It just seemed like they were doing interviews for sake of it, and they already had someone they planned on hiring. Especially since when we started, they said something along the lines of first day of interviews when I was waiting. Being my interview was 7:30 a.m., and it being the first day. Seems they are conducting interviews just for craps and giggles. Needless to say, I won't be applying to that company again. Story 16. For my recent job, I thought when they dropped the, "Well, do have other applicants we are going to get in touch with," I thought maybe that was the end for me. But I did actually get the job offer less than a week later. I guess they were just trying to be transparent, or the others they interviewed weren't as good. Usually that's a common red flag, but I guess it doesn't mean you're totally cooked either. Story 17. It's always the same question why you chose this company at the end. It's as if they have nothing else to say to conclude the call. For those offers I received, I was never asked this question from any of the hiring managers/interviewers. Story 18. A couple years ago, I was interviewing for a leadership position at a large tech company. The interviewer asked me, "What would be your goal to automate X 100% within a year?" I knew from personal experience that automating X 100% wasn't possible, and I explained that in depth and gave good examples as to why. While I spoke, the interviewer picked up their notebook, phone, and glasses case off the table and put them in their lap. They were ready to move on to the next thing on their schedule. The interview went on, but I knew immediately I was cooked. Story 19. The way they word things, some people who are interested in you as a candidate start slipping up and using we/us. And of course, rigid cold body language is another way they're not going to extend an offer or move forward. I agree with others on here, pointing out multiple candidates. While it's nice to have the recruiter admit how many candidates there are, it's painful when you hear it later on down the line, when you've been interviewing and waiting for many weeks. Here are some examples that I've experienced. 1. Looking back at an interview I had last week, I have realized that people who do not treat an interview with professionalism are likely not going to pay you any attention and simply will waste your time. The recruiter had a screaming child in the background. I overlooked it because I know remote work plus small children, it's noise, but the pure audacity of this hiring manager. They were outside, enjoying their yard, with the neighbors mowing. They complained about the company and department most of the interview and barely asked me any question. I received an absurd email with feedback that did not correlate to my experience or what I had said in the call. 2. I've also had people interviewing me who sent a wonderful email in the beginning with expectations and did not meet me halfway with the expectations and made it really uncomfortable. I knew I wasn't going to get that job either. 3. Being asked if you get along with X gender. I knew no matter how I answered that, I wasn't going to get that position. I felt really uncomfortable by even being asked such an absurd question. Story 20. I had a Zoom interview scheduled a few weeks ago. I tried joining the waiting room about 10 minutes early. I didn't have access to the meeting. Tried everything, couldn't get in. Sent an email explaining the situation, apologized, and asked to reschedule. Didn't get an actual response back, but a Zoom meeting invite for the next day. Luckily, was able to join the meeting this time, but the main interviewer barely said so much as hello to me. She wasn't present in the interview, let the other person, whose was leaving their position and helping find her replacement, ask all the questions. She was clearly working on something else on her computer and not paying any attention to me. And this was just an introductory interview. 15 minutes. I thought the interview with the other person went very well. I had the experience they needed and seemed to fit the position. But because of the main interviewer's demeanor and attitude, I didn't think I'd hear back. I sent off a thank you email that afternoon and never heard back. Never received any other communication but checked Workday and saw not selected for hire. It was disheartening because I felt had I actually been able to get into the first interview, I would have had a chance. But the interviewer wrote me off before she even spoke to me. Not sure why she even let me reschedule. Story 21. I'm black. I doubt you are. Just because we often aren't given the chance to interview for C-suite positions, even if we are qualified. I could be wrong, though. Anyway, how I know I'm not getting the job isn't exactly what the interviewer says, but how they react to seeing me for the first time. A lot of times, they'll barely or won't even look at me. Cowards. Nearing 40, I think it's funny, but a blessing in a sense. Leaving the interview immediately knowing I didn't get it. Now what pisses me off, though, is when I have multiple interviews. Everyone likes me. They keep pushing me through to the next round, and then I get to the final boss, the one who makes the decision. But once they lay eyes on me, they can't keep eye contact because they know they aren't picking me off the bat. Now that pisses me off. Time wasted. Story 22. If they tell you they are still reviewing other candidates or need approval from another manager, it usually is a no for me. I had an interview and they told me to come back for a second interview, and I was even given a date, but said they needed to check with the other manager for what time works best that day. Anyways, a few days passed, so I messaged them thanking them for the interview and asked if they had an update on the time. Crickets. This was probably my worst experience job hunting because they got my hopes up with the second interview and just completely crushed it. Story 23. I once had an interviewer get downright offended that she hadn't heard of something on my resume. I had written a legal brief for the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, ECCC. She asked me what that was, and when I told her it was a court of limited jurisdiction that invested crimes allegedly committed under the Khmer Rouge, she clearly got offended that one. She hadn't heard of it. And two, that I'd explained what it was when she asked, because doing so clearly indicated I thought she was an idiot. I didn't get the job. Story 24. It wasn't anything specifically said that I can remember, but when HR was setting up the interview, they said that the interview would last about an hour. Once I got there, things felt immediately off, and the interview lasted only 15 minutes. They barely asked me any questions except for the behavioral questions, which I felt like I fumbled through. I pretty much knew the second I left that I wasn't getting it. I got the rejection email like a week later. Story 25. At my previous job, if they weren't taking notes on your responses to questions, you were just a placeholder candidate to meet the interviewing quota. They already had someone picked out. Had that happened several times when trying to change departments. This was a well-known too. Story 26. I went for an interview and had to say I needed to order copies of important certificates, qualifications, etc. needed for the job due to flood damage. Interviewer said not to worry about it. Story 27. Interviewed with a young couple who co-owned a startup ad agency. They asked if I had children. Yeah, I know that's illegal now, but this was decades ago. I told them we recently had a son. Oh, how sweet, the wife said. Is he Inkrat Jr.? I told them I would never make a kid a junior because they usually end up with the diminutive Y at the end of their name, or they get saddled with junior as their name. Oh, well, we just had a son and named him after my husband, who is named after his dad, the woman replied. Yeah, I did not get that job. Story 28. I've interviewed at probably 100 places over the past 16 years. The ones that have almost always hired me use affirmative language like what you'll be doing, when you start, random person, will reach out to you to start the paperwork. Basically hired on the spot once they already placed you there. The ones that I never seem to get focused too much on your background. So I see you worked at Apple. What was that like? Why didn't you stay at this job? Do you have any experience using SQL? It's like they are hunting for a reason to not hire me. Story 29. Looked at their watch, said, oh, we still have some time, and started asking me stuff like where I got my earring. Did I see popular movie that just came out? Sipped her coffee and then told me where she got it and why that place is the best. You know, instead of explaining more about the job position and work culture, hours and pay, etc. Even when I asked, she'd tangent away from question. Story 30. Wasn't what they said, it was the look. I worked in food industry for 5 years and went to an interview for a new chicken fast food place, and the lady just smiled real condescending. Could tell instantly I wasn't getting the job. Story 31. For me, I've had several Zoom interviews lately, and when I notice the complete lack of enthusiasm when they see me, I'm pretty sure they're going to pass, even when the interview seems to go well. Story 32. Would you be happy with a temporary position? That was fun after an interview, online test of my skills, and then tried to offer me one half of what the original salary on the ad was. Get bent. Story 33. Wow, this is making me depressed. I'm waiting on a call, not email because that's 100% a rejection notice. I interviewed middle of last week. They have had 2 business days. Story 34. I've had at least 2 people we've hired said they couldn't read me at all. I've only had people who've done well ask me how they think they did. Didn't hire all of them? Story 35, I'm beginning to wonder if it's when they respond to your answers with, okay, thanks for that, because I got that several times during my recent search. Story 36, when there's a portion of the interview where they speed up and questions become less probing, or they sort of hand it over to you to ask questions prematurely. When I interview, it's normally with the CEO of very large businesses. Unfortunately, at this level, they are far more concerned with exactly what they're looking for, and less interested in what you can offer holistically. I've never really understood in real time what I said or didn't say, but I've learned that this modest change in the interview means they didn't hear something they were looking for, and the interview is over, even if it goes for another 20 minutes. Story 37. My fiance went through 4 rounds of interviews for a sales position. During the last interview, they asked him his 5-year plan. When he told them he wanted to finish his degree in accounting and eventually move out of sales, they told him that was a red flag, and then the next day said they decided to go with someone else. I told him next time, just lie and say you want to stay working there if that's what they want to hear. Kind of stupid of them when the job had no upward mobility opportunities. I guess they just want you to stay content at the same level with moderately decent pay forever and never quit. Story 38. In the interview I got hired on, I could tell they were frothing at the mouth for me by the end and basically said everything but, "You're hired." In the others, I got rejected one of them. I just had a massive brain fart with a tool I was using, and that fried me, and they were being kind of junks about it, so I knew I wasn't getting that crap. First interview, I just knew I wasn't answering the questions the way they wanted, and was pulling off a massive choke job. I generally can tell if I'm getting a job by looking at my own performance in the interview. Story 39. My husband has just been through a job search, and we noticed that every time someone told him, "It's just between you and X other candidate," it meant he wasn't getting the job. Our theory is that interviewers say this to make the candidate feel good, but what it really means is, you weren't good enough for us to cancel the interview with the next guy, or the next candidate is our preferred one, so you're only getting the job if they really blow the interview. Story 40. Had an interview that seemed to be going well, but there was one skill she mentioned she would prefer a candidate to have. I told her I didn't have that yet, but would be excited to learn. She stressed it wasn't that big of a deal, and we continued. Then at the end, she goes over how I'll hear from her early next week. I say that I'm looking forward to it, and she says, "Good luck with your job search," and closes the Zoom meeting. I never heard back. Story 41. I asked, "Is there anything that would prevent you from offering the job to me now?" And she said, "No, we could really use someone with your experience. I wish I had more jobs." I thought that a weird comment, but in hindsight, they gave it not to someone better qualified, but to someone who was already in their employment system. I was not, but eminently better qualified than the person who got the job. Story 42. Had an interview a month or so back that I felt went pretty well. Got invited back for a second round interview a day later with the HR manager. She sat there with a face like a slapped arse and said no more than half a dozen words throughout the whole thing. Already knew I wasn't going to get the job within the first 5 minutes of her being there. Story 43. I interviewed at Amazon Engineering on site in one of their cattle calls. Round of 3 interviews in the morning. Then they sent me on my way around noon. I had a friend who worked there already who later told me if they were going to hire you, they'd feed you lunch and schedule afternoon interviews. That's how they do. Story 44. I applied for an internal job posting. I reached out to my manager first to let them know, and they offered to reach out to the hiring manager and recommend me. I was grateful for it and felt hopeful as she was a senior exec and well known in the organization. First red flag I got was they scheduled my interview during the hiring MGR's vacation and told me the person I'm replacing, retiring after they trained their replacement, would interview me. I offered to delay the interview, but they said it was fine. During the interview, the person spent all 30 minutes talking about the role, never asked me any questions, and would interrupt me when I tried to ask questions. After the first 10 minutes, I was like, this is a courtesy interview. Then I spent the next 20 minutes wondering why my manager's recommendation fell on deaf ears. During a team meeting, my manager goes, "I have good and bad news. We are losing my favorite person, John, who was just hired for the role. I can't think of anyone else more deserving. Double burn. Left that manager as soon as the chance came up. Story 45, not me, but my boyfriend's story. 3 rounds of video interviews, he's loving the people, they're loving him, and they've asked for him to come in for a final in-person interview. He gets there after he's studied for a few days, their systems and products. He's put in effort. They sit him down and point blank say, "So, you're the only one of the finalists without a degree. You'll have to really impress us for us not to go with the other 2 applicants." He immediately was in a different headspace, knowing he's lost the gig. The other 2 degreed people will have to absolutely bomb for him to have a shot. He completed the interview, left, and didn't expect a call back. He didn't get one. He got a rejection email saying they'd gone with someone with more educational experience. Joke's on them. This week, he started at an amazing company who offered more starting out than they did and didn't care he didn't have a degree. They saw his experience and how he built himself from the ground up and succeeded all the way. Story 46. I got an initial interview with a recruiter that asked me a few not-so-legal questions about kids and family that I was not supposed to disclose as per the country laws. But I needed a job, so I let it go. Then it was followed up with a very nice interview with the person who was supposed to be my manager, and we really clicked and talked about very similar views that we had regarding the job. I was kind of confident until the final interview with the startup CEO that made me uncomfortable the whole time. I am a woman and was on my 20s at the time, asked me the dumbest questions that I've ever heard in an interview and put his feet on his desk. At that moment, I was like, okay, this is over. He just want to pose as a big important guy and is not taking me seriously. Story 47. When they run out of questions before time is up, all my successful interviews have run way out of their planned time. Or someone says abruptly something like, "Oh, I see we only have 5 minutes left. We still have a lot of questions, but we do need to start wrapping up because reason X, Y, Z." All interviews I had that were concluded before the scheduled time was over were a definite no, but thank you for coming in. Story 48. I was repeatedly that I should definitely keep applying if I wasn't selected for the position. I did apply again a few months later and was hired. My boss told me they were extremely impressed by my first interview, but it was just a formality as they already had a preferred candidate, which I ended up being during the next opening. Story 49. We had a revolving door of directors here with people just getting a leg up and leaving. That is when I had to step up for the department. Current director in front of a peer staff interview. That was when my soul departed the interview and knew I was not accepting their offer. Someone really enjoys their own pussy. Story 50. I was interviewing at a company I'd worked for previously, and within the first 2 minutes, I knew I didn't have a chance. He glanced at my resume and handed it back to me saying I'd probably need it for the future. I was extremely qualified for the position, so I'm not sure what his deal was. Story 51. I forget the details of the conversation, but one time, I was speaking over a recruiter for a new position, and I heard my phone ding with a new mail sound. Finished the conversation and checked my email. It was a rejection email from her, sent while I was on the phone with her. Story 52. Sometimes people are supposed to join a bit later and ask specific questions from their areas of expertise. When they don't join, it is probably a sign that they were told not to bother. Also, sometimes people leave halfway through the interview, which can be an indicator. Story 53. Interviewing for Macy's, and the guy assigned to be bad cop for the case study panel interview said a couple of minutes before we wrapped up, "Try not to reference your notes in future interviews." I said, "Thank you for your feedback," and knew it was over. Story 54. "Well, honey, whatever do you want to be in data processing for?" Say slowly with a drawl. This is in the early 80s. It was the first thing he said. I did not roll my eyes out loud. I did want to correct his grammar. Story 55. Thanks for your time. We have many candidates we're considering. Most jobs I've landed, I was hired during the interview. If they like a candidate, a lot of times they'll extend an offer on the spot. Story 56. When asked how soon they're looking to fill the position, we want to hire quickly, but won't fill it just to fill it. A week later, I receive an email that they're putting hiring on hold. Story 57. It's a reminder of how much reading between the lines matters in interviews and how sometimes people protect themselves from having to give a direct rejection. Story 58. I had an interview with a company where the husband and wife owners would meet possible hires as part of a sanity check, and on the face of it seemed reasonable and a nice touch, even to those that didn't get hired. At the end of the interview, which seemed to go well, one of the interviewers went off to find the husband or wife owner to come and meet me. I knew my line manager had interviewed for the same job a few days before, as our previous company had gone under, so I knew my chances of getting the job were somewhat reduced. However, when the interviewer came back and said that the owners were pushed for time with something else, I knew the decision had been made already and I hadn't got the job. I wouldn't have thought more of it had the interviewers not made a bit of a deal about meeting the owners, and it had been part of the interviewing process. Suffice to say, my line manager got the permanent job, and a month or so later, I got back in contact about some short-term contract positions. I worked alongside my former line manager for a few months, whereupon one morning I get to work and he's not there. Apparently, he'd not passed his probationary period and was let go. I worked a few more months, and my contract comes to end. They can't offer me anything else as my immediate managers are unsure of future projects, so I leave, satisfied with the work I'd done. A few months later, that company was shut down by their parent company. Had I got the original position, I would have moved house, as it was some distance away, so in some ways I dodged a bullet. Story 59. Back in June of this year, I was in the first of 2 interviews. The first interview was just to get to know each other, and the second interview was going to be technical. As I logged into the Zoom meeting, I noticed that there were 6 people on the panel instead of the 2, the recruiter and the admin. They introduced themselves, and without asking me basic questions of who I am and what I've done or what my experiences were, the IT director asked me to do some subnetting. And when I couldn't get the correct IP addresses, he exhaled and said, "Okay, I'm done with this interview." I knew right there and then that this was not the person I wanted to work for, and he is definitely not going to hire me. The interview lasted about 10 minutes. It was for a NOC technician eye roll only. FYI, I have my CCNA, but the last time I did any practice was in December 2023. Story 60. 1. Someone asked me, "What's your most annoying habit?" Caught off guard, I responded, "I ask a lot of questions at first so I can learn faster. I'm uncomfortable not knowing." Him. Condescending laugh and, "Yeah, I can see that in you." 2. A woman was greeted me with her face inches from mine. I think I recoiled a little, because it seemed too close. The interview seemed to go well. She was very nice. She played with her hair. At the end, she walks me to the elevator. We're talking and she thanks me and I then her, and I see her face grimace. 3. Another time, departing an interview, and as I'm leaving, I inquire where the other office is located, where she had said she wanted to interview me for, and walking away, she snaps coldly, "Downtown." Story 61. I find it unethical to as an older potential employee. "So, what are your career plans for the next 10 years? Actual question. They have a lot of ways to discriminate against age. DOB, including year that is required, high school/college graduation date, entire employment history, yes, been asked for this too. And as previously stated, a major hint you're not going to get the job/interview is body language and tone of voice. Especially listen to the tone of voice they lastly speak in with you. It's especially obvious on the phone. That glad to be off the phone drop in tone, or the implication that while you may have had a great interview, they've already got someone else in mind. Just a few things I've picked up over the past 50 years. Story 62. I think I screwed up too. After many rounds for a small private college in Massachusetts, I ended with the president having dinner. After a great chat in the lobby and then a long dinner where I felt great throughout. After we got up and walked out, she paid the bill, which I expected. She made it clear, "I got this," and I left. Should I have waited and walked out with her? We waved goodbye in our cars. Also, I sent a follow-up email to the HR person I've been working with throughout the process. A fresh email, not a reply to a previous one. Thanking the president for dinner and a great day, and I haven't heard anything back. That was last week. Normally he, HR director, gets back to me right away. Story 63. In the beginning of the interview, I was told how this is a very short process and what I needed to do at the job. Like duties-wise, then the interviewer/owner mentioned how he doesn't no for an answer. And if he is called at 3 a.m. from a client, he picks up, so he's expecting the same thing from me, forgetting a small detail: owner, client equals profit. I was an employee, so the 3 a.m. call was still just my salary. And I said, "I appreciate it, but I also want to tell you that I have a family and that my family is my priority." He changed demeanor and started praising my resume and said, "We are just in the beginning of the process and will be a long process." From "this is short," it became long. I knew here and there, recruiters. What is the oddest, funniest thing you've seen written on a CV or covering letter? Story 1. I had a guy who offered guild leader, guild name World of Warcraft, as an example of his leadership and people skills. I thought that was hilarious, but the rest of his CV was good, so we did interview him. He turned out to be great, with good interpersonal skills and a talent for leading projects, so what the duck do I know? Maybe WoW is a good training ground. Story 2. I've worked in university postgrad admissions for a long time and seen a lot of crap. I had one student write something like, "Simulate earthquake by shaking table under experience." Assume some sort of experiment, but it was funny. Countless international students starting their personal statements with Harry Potter quotes. Probably the most memorable one was someone applying for a business master's, who presented their personal statement as an interview with himself in the FT 10 years in the future, when he was a VP at Goldman Sachs. This included the question, so if you already had such an incredible academic track record, why did you need the MSc from X university? He then wrote his response, laughs. Well, yes, I guess I was pretty incredible. I did not add the laugh. Ducking cringe. Story 3. My company have a careers page where any vacancies are listed. There's also a place for people to send in their CVs, fill in their details, and write a bit about themselves if we don't have any current roles that suit them, in case anything comes up in future. Got one high-caliber applicant by the name of Duck the Job Center, who was currently working as a professional ducker at your mom's house. The CV he uploaded was a MS Paint file of a crude drawing of the tools of his trade. He had to provide a phone number on the application, so we were honestly thinking about calling him in for an interview just for the laughs. Story 4. That he had been vasectomized. Really couldn't see the relevance. Don't worry if I have an inter-office affair. At least she won't be going on maternity leave. Story 5. The most baffling application for a junior sales role I've ever seen. Skills included general skills I have practiced on my elderly parents and ability to work in a very cold environment. Under previous experience was fully trained in the construction of underground safe holds. He never answered his phone, so I never found out what a safe hold is, underground or otherwise. Story 6. I wish I had kept some of the stuff we had over the years, as some of it was hilarious and I can't remember it all now. We had one guy who spelt his own name wrong on his CV. We knew as his cover letter was correct. A lot of people from India and Pakistan used to apply IT work and often used Google Translate. We had one guy whose letter turned into German halfway through, and we got a few gems like this. I have seen the junior IS technician job opportunity on the website and interested this position. I am more oriented a goal and results a manshaft spieler, which is reliable and punctual. Additionally, I developed far my release from problems and analytics. I am the even M to a higher degree, motivated and substantial width was given. Behavior skills, driven, excellent communicator, Microsoft Office suite. I hope that this experience can help you to become one of Plymouth's leading company. We were in London and we were a school. Story 7. A lot of Bible quotes throughout the cover letter and on the CV. At one point, he referred to the job as doing God's work. The job was generic office admin. Story 8. 1. All their Cub Scout badges from when they were 10. They were 55, and this was for an IT project manager contract role. Their CV was 6 pages. They were not invited for interview. 2. A snotty covering letter saying, I've applied for this role 3 times, business analyst role in a large payments company, and not been invited for interview. Maybe this time, I will be lucky. They were a door-to-door Avon salesperson with no relevant experience. We take trainees, but this role specified 3 to 5 years of experience. Story 9. I used to do a management role. Once had a CV that on one side was a regular CV and on the other was a photocopy of a lasagna recipe. He did not make it to interview, and I did not try the lasagna recipe. Story 10. Not a recruiter, but I am a manager. Once got a resume in an envelope. When I opened, it was full of glitter. Glitter went freaking everywhere. Inside on Hello Kitty stationery was a cover letter starting with, now that have your attention, let me bring some sparkle to your team. Oh, hell no. Story 11. Michael is a big fat junk. In the middle of the cover letter, the client had requested one, and I think cover letters are pants. I reached out to Michael and asked him about it. His response, oh my God, I'm going to hurt Neil. I actually put him through for interview. He was a nice kid. Story 12. My partner was involved in some recruitment at his job. One of the candidates included a link to his personal blog in his CV. Potentially fine if it's relevant to the role, I guess. But the first entry on this blog was him complaining candidly about how much he resents having to work. Just seemed a bizarre thing to share in a job application. Story 13. Had a guy who applied for a job. Must have been a joke. He claimed his name was Battyman 3000 and that his granddad lent him 10 quid so it showed he could bring in revenue. Story 14. Friend at a hairdresser's. Literally spelled like this. I sweep hair up and clean up in that. I can't cut hair yet, but I'm sure it's not hard and I can learn that too. Story 15. Had a guy who applied for jobs multiple times and would self-sabotage. His application said he had been searching for jobs for years with no luck. Thanks for telling us. And that he had done various courses, customer service, IT, etc., but none of them have helped much. He would go on and on about his age and how he was slow and not very good at this or that. He was obviously being pressured to apply for jobs, but had no interest is actually getting one. Story 16. A couple stand out. I worked as a housekeeper for 2 months, and the best ever was a candidate listing their qualities in bold bullet points right at the top of the CV. Attention to detail, punctual, fast learner, attention to detail. Story 17. I'm in the market at the moment, and as a 46-year-old man, I'm sorely tempted to put a note on my CV to the effect of, perfectly willing to try and sleep my way to the top, if only to edit out po-faced S. Sadly, bills need to be paid. Story 18. My colleague interviewed a bunch of people for the data manager at a school. The guy's opening sentence was, "My name is Mr. the Data Hero." His name rhymed with hero. He did not get the job, but I wish he did. Story 19. I had a candidate include a tea bag, a sachet of coffee of the type you get in a Holiday Inn, and small packet of biscuits, also of the type you get in the Holiday Inn, with a post-it note telling me to enjoy a well-earned break while perusing my CV. It was a nice gesture, but his CV was in Comic Sans and we didn't interview him. Story 20. I am constantly amused by how many bar professionals in their 40s and 50s have their primary school on their CV or LinkedIn. Are they filling space to cover their deep, dark void? Or do they actually consider this crap useful? Story 21. Not odd, but weird for me. Different culture rather than individually weird, but I interviewed staff for a British company recruiting in India. CVs often included their father's/husband's name and occupation. Story 22. I'm amazed by the number of applicants with real depth and experience and many years under their belt that still put on their CV that they had a Saturday job at Woolworths in 1996. Story 23. The first page of the CV featured a picture of the candidate lounging on a posh chair. They were about 70,000 pounds candidate, so it's not like they did not know what is appropriate. Story 24. I used to work in a restaurant/bar, and somebody sent in this really nice, well-presented CV. It was top of the pile, until I noticed insert skills here on one of the sections. My manager decided it was for the bin after that. I felt bad for pointing it out, but I also felt it was unfair to scrap a CV just for that. If you use a template, make sure you make it look like you didn't use a template. Story 25. I once had a guy claim to be Poland's second best bus driver on a CV, complete with a picture of him standing next to a battered coach in a car park, baseball cap on, and cigarette in hand. Another dude padded out his experience at a meat processing factory, but bullet pointing the types of meat he processed, like including beef, lamb, chicken, and many other meats. He was applying for the role of finance assistant. Another time, I interviewed a guy with a spider crawling in his hair the whole way through. If I'd said anything, I'd have lost it. It's generally a dull experience, but does offer occasional amusement. Story 26. Someone had a perfect CV. They had been forwarded TONUS from the job center. UK, if collecting unemployment benefit, they put you forward for jobs. Guy obviously had no intention of working, as in the final part of the CV. He had a line under qualities that said, I can dodge bullets and am impervious to pain. Obviously just made rest of CV look amazing. So Job Center didn't read it thoroughly. Story 27. Years ago, under other interests, junking and church choir, she meant cooking and was a very proper church lady who was mortified. I couldn't stop laughing and she got the job. She was one of my best team members and a lovely person. Story 28. I worked in a fast food place. Nothing odd about what was written, but more what the CV was written on. Customer saw we were hiring and scribbled his qualifications on a napkin and handed it in. Story 29. An entire medical history woven into his career section. Interesting read, but couldn't be less relevant to the role. No one needs to know about your hernia operations or prostate exams. Interviewers have read it. What was your worst candidate? And what did they say that made them memorable? Story 1. I used to work at a store in a mall. Normally, we would sit out in the food court to do interviews. It was terrible. Anyway, this lady came in for her interview and had a baby with her. She goes on this rant about how hard it is to find childcare and how expensive it is. I get it. It's happened before. No big deal. Anyway, we're halfway through and her friend walks by, not knowing who I was. I was in my normal street clothes because I technically wasn't on the clock, and asked her when she was going to be done because she has to take her niece back home. She wasn't supposed to leave the house while babysitting. Turns out she thought bringing a baby would make me feel sorry for her and give her a job. Story 2. I was hiring for some part-time work and a younger woman applied. She had a decent resume, but at the interview she was totally dismissive and disinterested. When I asked her what she liked about our company, she said with a straight face, "I'm just doing this to show my husband I can get a job." That was the quickest end to an interview I've ever had. Story 3. Small software development firm, 50-ish employees. We're hiring a new CTO. The entire development team gets an hour to conduct a group interview. The interview was comfortable, relaxed. I look over at one point, and the lead developer, employee number 1 when the place was just a startup, has the following scribed on his notepad, HDSF. The interviewee says, "And yeah, I honestly don't give a crap if people work from home." And my lead developer puts another tick next to S on his paper. Dude did not get the job. Pro tip, when interviewing for executive level jobs, or any job really, don't drop F-bombs in the interview. Story 4. Describe a time that you had to deal with an irate or difficult customer. The applicant went on to describe a time while working as airport security, they tased someone who attempted to enter through an exit door. It was clear even from their side of the story that the person did not understand, and that language was a barrier. And it actually went downhill from there. Story 5. I was interviewing someone for a graphic design position. I am a graphic designer. She had several terrible answers over the course of the interview, but her worst was when I asked her to tell me about her favorite project in the portfolio she brought, and to tell me a little about her design process. She proceeded to point out a project she made her friend, a t-shirt design based on a quote they both liked from How I Met Your Mother, and how it was fun because of how much they liked the show. I tried to press a little bit for an actual answer to help her out. Why that font? How about color choice? The design wasn't great to begin with, and also probably the weakest in her portfolio, so it was a stretch to get any answer here. But I was trying to throw her a bone. She proceeded to repeat stuff about how she liked it, and how much her friend liked it, and how much they loved the show. What should be obvious to anyone, even if you're not a graphic designer, is that you should probably be able to say a little more about your work at an interview outside of, my friend liked it and I love this show. I still wonder if she ever got a design job. Story 6. I have a story. I work at a hotel. At that time, I was just a desk clerk. A young lady came in, asked if we were hiring in housekeeping. Our head housekeeper was still in, so I called, told her there was an applicant. She told me she had a minute, she'd be right over. She comes out of her office down the hallway to meet this lady, takes one glance at her and says, "We're not hiring." Once she left, the head housekeeper told me, "Don't send anyone looking like that to me." I asked why. She replied, "Did you not see how she was dressed?" Okay, now I noticed. The young lady was wearing torn jeans with no underwear. Half her rear end was showing. A halter top that covered virtually nothing, everything was hanging out. And she was wearing stripper heels. Oh, okay, now I understand. Story 7. I was interviewed a guy who didn't have English as his first language, and I'm pretty sure he learned it from watching Star Wars, since his phrasing was very similar to Han Solo. He would always be like, "My friend, let's talks about this," stuff like that. I actually liked him until he said, "Well, I was working with a lady who was on her monthly cycle, so she couldn't work hard that week," which frustrated me. Story 8. I've sat on quite a few interviews for attorneys where I work. Here are my top 3 bad interviews. 1. Guy calls the front desk 15 minutes after the interview is scheduled to say that he got lost and if he could come in later. We had a slot open after someone canceled, so we told him to come in. When he gets there, it doesn't appear that he had any idea what we do, and at one point says, "I'm not sure what I'm doing here," and then left. 2. This guy is qualified but doesn't yet have his license yet. Just needs to make a call to the state bar to find out what's left. He'd already applied and paid, just never followed up to get the license. When we ask him, he says he's been waiting for months, just never got around to it. Others were worried he was lazy, but we ended up hiring him as soon as he called to get licensed. He's in my team now and is one of the hardest working and funniest people there. 3. I work in juvenile law, so child protection and juvenile delinquency. Public defenders represent the majority of our delinquent youth, and we had an applicant who had interned with the PD's office. Considering that maybe 25% of our cases are delinquency, we asked her what she thought we did at the office. Her response, lock kids up and terminate their parents' rights? Which is partly true, but the opposite of our philosophy and practice. I thought she was horribly arrogant and would never fit. She ended up being incredibly good at the job and one of the few attorneys I work with that I would be worried about having as opposing counsel. Story 9. Someone came in for a project manager position at a digital/creative ad agency. I asked a few get-to-know-you questions, then a few experience-based questions. Next, I said, "I'm going to ask you a few rapid-fire questions about your resume and experience. It's going to feel like a test, but if you don't know the answer, just say, 'I don't know,' and I'll move on. No harm, no foul. Cool?" "Yeah, absolutely." So I scan his resume to see what I think he's embellishing. It's not that I particularly care about these skills. I just want to know if he's full of crap and how he reacts to getting asked things he doesn't know. In the skills section of his resume, it says, proficient in Adobe Creative Suite, Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign. So I ask him, what's the difference between Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Illustrator? He starts stuttering. Then his eye starts twitching. Then it looks like he's about to have a panic attack. He stares at me for 20 seconds or so, then says, "I'd like to end the interview." I thank him for his time. He leaves the room and goes to our HR manager and starts to curse me out, yelling that I gave him a nervous twitch and that I'm an asshole. He didn't get the job. Story 10. I interview salespeople for a living. Most of them are actually pretty cool and are selling in pharmaceuticals for the right reason. Surprisingly, they're highly educated. Many have MBAs or nursing degrees. Before I took my job, I assumed most of them would be arrogant and money hungry. Only on about 3 occasions have I said someone meet that criteria. Sales numbers are obviously pretty important when you're interviewing for a sales position, especially if you're working in a crowded market. like migraines or pain management, for instance. A client of ours was waiting for approval on a migraine medication. This brought on a lot of new types of salespeople with different backgrounds. The consistent piece was that they had to be a strong performer. I spoke with a guy from the Southeast who had been underperforming for 4 consecutive years. I always like to put context to things. It is my job, after all. I asked if there may have been a contributing factor to his slip in his performance. He proceeded to yell at me for 40 minutes thereafter, and he told me I would deeply regret not passing him along. He told me he knew where my office building was and knew who my boss was. Normally, I'd let someone at least finish their interview, but I ended up disqualifying him on the spot. Story 11. I once interviewed an applicant for a housekeeper in a nursing home. This was back when you could smoke indoors. We sat in the lobby for the interview and the applicant was smoking. He kept flicking the ashes on the floor. That was a short interview. Story 12. Funny enough, it was the interviewer for my job that told me that. I arrived for my interview in a pantsuit and white button-up. He told me the kid before me showed up in pajamas. Story 13. I have a bunch of bad ones. Pick whichever one you think is the worst. There was the guy who looked like he had come straight from the gym. Under Armour type, stretchy tank top, track pants, sneakers, everything. We're an IT company, so jeans and any shirt with buttons is fine. There was the guy who locked up on every question. I was sitting in and the interviewer was super patient, but getting through the set of questions took far longer than it should have. There was the hot girl that one of my employees had been coaching/training. She had all the right answers, but no knowledge behind it. There was the guy on a phone screen that knew we were 24/7, 365, and only my boss had a MF business hours type gig. He was looking for something conforming to business hours. He did not get invited in to interview in person. There was the girl who was getting phone screened, didn't have an answer for the first question, and hung up on me. She ignored my calls and didn't try to reschedule. There was the guy who I was on the fence about inviting in. His attitude was good, but he was technically lacking. I gave him a study list and told him to schedule at least a week out with the recruiter. He took the next available interview slot and didn't study enough, which made him ineligible for future opportunities and wasted everyone's time. There was the guy who was okay, but was a lone wolf that didn't play well with others. It was a team environment with no individual contributors. Finally, there was the guy with such severe anxiety he couldn't really talk to others. I vetoed him, but my boss eventually overrode me when we couldn't find anyone else. He was a specialist. He was okay for a while, but his oral communication continued to lack, and he was eventually released when my boss was replaced and the scrutiny was raised. Story 14. She never made it to the interview, but a resume we received for an entry-level position was so memorable. She had a selfie on the front. Underneath, she listed her marital status and zodiac sign, and to finish out the resume, she included fun facts about herself. The best one was that bubble baths are my favorite. Story 15. I remember where one time I went into a place I heard was hiring and was going to ask for an application. Lo and behold, they were just about to start interviews, so they wanted to just go ahead and interview me. I was dressed decent, jeans, belt, and button-up, and did my interview. Not great, but not terrible. As I walked out, I see a waiting room full of more interviewees, all dressed in suits, briefcases, the whole shebang. I felt like a loser as I was walking out. Story 16. At the time, I was the quality engineering manager, and I was hiring a regulatory engineer. HR gave me 3 resumes to work with. I called the phone number listed on the first one. I have to mention here that I'm a woman. I call, a woman answers. I introduce myself with name, position, and company, and say that I'm calling for John Smith. The woman who answers isn't having it. Who are you, and why are you calling my husband? I explain again who I am and where I work and that I have his resume in front of me. She skips over that point and yells at me some more and wants to know who I think I am calling her house. When it finally clicks that I'm trying to get hold of her husband to schedule a job interview, does her tone change in a hurry? Oh, I see, he's not in right now, but I'll be sure to have him call you. The icing on that particular crap cake is that he was a total waste of time in the interview. He treated me like someone not worth his time. Wanted to know if he was interviewing with anyone else, like, a manager. His only question for me at the end of the interview was how long he had to stay in this job before he could bid on other jobs in the company. Yeah, no, dude. Story 17. I'll do it. Not an interviewer, but an interviewee. I was applying for a part-time computer lab consultant at a for-profit private college for evening students. The job was basically to hold the hands of students using the computer equipment. I told the guy that I'd be coming in for the interview after a day of field technician work because there was no other choice, and he said casual was fine. I worked at the job that day, and it was replacing and upgrading computers at the site, which meant crawling under desks and getting all sorts of dirt and dust on you. Dress code was khakis and a collared shirt. At the end of the day, I had filthy khakis and filthy collared shirt plus a clean tie. I go into the job interview and see the owner of the company with an Italian suit that was custom fitted and easily worth more than a month's salary while I'm looking like a damned orphan begging for coins from Ebenezer Scrooge. My self-confidence tanked and I didn't get the job. Story 18. Not my interview, but a coworker's. A coworker met a nice cab driver, so he recommends him to our recruiter. She interviewing this guy for an entry-level position. He proceeds to name drop HRC and then say he'd rather have a job acting as an advisor to our board of directors. Minimum salary, $300,000. It did turn out he had photos with all the Clintons on his Insta. Story 19. I used to manage a mom-and-pop type candy store. Minimum wage, nothing special, but we had no shortage of applicants because who wouldn't want to work at a candy store? So I had a lot of memorable interviews. One kid, still in high school, was maybe 16 but looked 13, showed up in a suit and tie because he'd been told to dress for the job you want, not the job you have. And he wanted to be a doctor eventually. I hired him. Another high schooler had no work experience, pretty common. But instead of trying to BS his way through scenario-type questions, he quietly thought for a moment and then said, I think I would have to ask you about that, and then stick around to learn what you did so I could do that next time. I was blown away. He turned out to be one of my best employees, but I was not expecting that answer from someone with so little experience. On the other side of things, I had not one but 3 people tell me they were only interviewing with me so they could get leverage to negotiate a raise at their current jobs. They were interviewing for a part-time, minimum wage position, and their other jobs were in offices or customer service. I also interviewed and hired a guy who interviewed, okay, did fine through his first day, then disappeared. Didn't call, didn't answer his phone. The emergency contact he listed was a disconnected number. He showed up again a week later, claiming he had been hospitalized due to a seizure and hadn't been allowed access to a phone. He couldn't produce any documentation saying he was cleared to go back to work, had a fresh cut above his eye with no dressing, and appeared to be nursing a couple of bruised ribs. I assumed he had been in jail and called him on it. He immediately changed his story and claimed he had been assaulted and abducted, only just managing to free himself, hence the injuries. But again, couldn't produce a police report or documentation from the hospital he said the police had taken him to. Oh, and he absolutely reeked of weed. I won't necessarily fire somebody if they got busted for possession, if it's just pot and not like heroin. But damn, bro, just be honest. And maybe don't come back to work stoned. Story 20. My college instructor told me once at his previous job, he interviewed a guy who came in decked out in weed paraphernalia and 30 minutes late on top of that. He didn't need to say anything. Instructor sent him back home immediately. Story 21. We interviewed a person who was already on the team. She phoned it in, just a horrible zero-effort interview. I still had to fill out a 5-page form for HR. Story 22. I'll never forget this guy. I was interviewing for a programmer and was asking some questions. On one question, he had to draw out a database diagram. He got partway through and said, if you want to know the rest, you'll have to hire me, and chuckled. For some reason, I kept going with the interview to the hands-on portion. I think I said something like, I hope you feel like coding for this next question. And he replied, not really, but let's get this over with. I was so shocked with his apathy, I just kept going. In hindsight, I should have cut the interview short and got him out of there. He butchered the code he had to refactor so badly it didn't even build, let alone pass any unit test. I discussed this guy with my colleagues quite a bit because we wanted to know how a guy like this even exists. My leading theory is that he's a deadbeat with a wife/girlfriend, and she said, you need to at least look for a job. So he's applying for jobs here and there, but purposely blowing the interviews so he can stay home. I've probably interviewed 50+ people in my life, and this guy was the only guy who was this bad. I've interviewed people who don't know stuff, but they at least try. They act like they want the job. Story 23. I work in a manufacturing facility. Guy was 10 minutes late to his interview. Red flag number 1. He came in wearing a t-shirt and shorts in 15 degrees Fahrenheit weather. Red flag number 2. His hair was a mess, and he obviously just woke up before leaving his house. Red flag number 3. A terrible interview and a waste of about 10 minutes of time, but I'm ready to call it done, so I ask him if he has questions. He asks what positions we have available. I give a brief overview of 2 positions. One is super entry level and pays approximately $13. One is for a more skilled position and pays approximately $17. He says, oh yeah, they both sound okay, but when you give me a job, can I just have one that I don't really have to do anything for the $17? Never have I ever been so dumbfounded during an interview. Who says in an interview that they don't want to work? Story 24. I was a newly graduated nurse working at a nursing home. My boss was interviewing nurses to fill a second position, so I would be working with whomever got the job. Boss comes to me and says they've just interviewed someone who they plan on hiring, although they haven't told her that. Asks me to give this person a tour of the facility. It turns out that the candidate and I did our training together. We vaguely know each other. She spends the whole tour telling me about how she has no interest in working in a nursing home. She is just looking for a job to pay the bills until she can get a job in a hospital. She will be leaving first chance she gets. I don't know why she was surprised when I told my boss this, and she did not get the job. Story 25. During technical whiteboard coding interview. Him. I would just Google it. Me. Sure, but for the sake of this exercise, how would you do it? Him. I think Google it. Me. The internet is down, chief. Him. No, Google. Story 26. He wore sweats and Birkenstocks to the interview. He smelled a bit of BO. All of his answers were spot on, but also lacking in subtlety or tact. It was like the stereotype of the IT guy with no social skills taken to its extreme. Story 27. I once had a woman come to an interview dressed in a fishnet dress, watching neon pink bra/underwear combo with 3-inch heels. She also had full-length braids. She spiraled out during the interview and she obviously didn't get the job. Story 28. I'm a student at an Ivy League university and recently volunteered to interview undergrad applicants. One kid rubbed me the wrong way a little when he said he wanted to study here so he could become an investment banker. Like, no shame in wanting to secure the bag, but come on, dude. I'm interested in what you want to, study.